Cleaning lady pays metro fare for a stranger, not knowing he is a millionaire. What he did next surprised everyone. The city looked like it was made of grey that morning. The sky was a dull extension of the wet sidewalk, and the steam rising from the manhole covers carried the bittersweet smell of cold mixed with old diner grease. Helen kept her eyes down as she walked down the steps of the 145th Street station. Her scrubs had faded, her backpack hung off one shoulder, and in her hands was a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. The night had been long. The ER was packed, another mother waiting with a feverish child in her arms, another elderly man left behind, no one coming to get him. Helen didn't complain. It had been like that for years. Honest, quiet work. What kept her going wasn't the paycheck. It was a quiet faith that despite everything, the world could still be less harsh if people were less indifferent. The crowd bustled on the platform. The train horn echoed through the tunnels like a metallic lament. She swiped her card, heard the beep. She was about to go through the turnstile when she noticed from the corner of her eye a man standing still. Tall, unshaven, his blazer soaked. He held a card, but the red light on the screen denied him entry. Helen stopped. He wasn't homeless, but he also didn't look like he belonged there. Something about him felt out of place, maybe the empty stare like someone walking through internal ruins. He tried again. Red light. And stayed there, motionless, not asking for help, as if unsure what to do next. Without thinking, she held out her card, swiped it through the reader and looked at the man, indicating he could go through. He hesitated, as if expecting some hidden demand. But there was none. Helen gave a slight nod as if to say, "Go ahead." He walked through, murmured something that sounded like "thank you," though his voice seemed to catch mid-sentence. She didn't respond, just went through the turnstile behind him and entered the next train car. Inside the train, leaning slightly against the wall, Helen looked at the man farther ahead. He stood, hands still trembling. One of his fists was stained with dry blue ink. There was something there, not just confusion, a kind of absence, as if the world passed through him without leaving a mark. Helen looked away and caught her reflection in the train window. She thought about the decision she had made instinctively. So many people walked past him, and no one stopped. She wondered if she would have done the same if she were more tired, with less patience. But there was something about that moment, something that couldn't be explained, only done. She remembered what her mother used to say, "If someone's on the ground, you reach out your hand, even if you don't know them, even if you don't have time." And in that simple gesture, Helen felt a strange unease, as if she had touched something larger than a metro card, as if she had brushed up against a story on the verge of being told. When he got off at the next station, she watched him go. He walked slowly, like he was trying to remember where he was. Then he disappeared into the crowd, but something about him stayed with her. Hours later, Helen arrived home. The apartment was small, with narrow walls and a scent of chamomile tea lingering in the dish towels. The dim light from the window made the place feel even cozier. The walls were covered with drawings taped up, some made by Emma when she was little, others by Helen herself during sleepless nights. The couch sagged more than it should, and the rug was frayed at the corners, but there was life there. There was warmth. Every object seemed to carry a story. A picture frame with a faded photo of Helen holding a young Emma. A crooked bookshelf full of nursing textbooks. A round table with a stained but clean tablecloth. In the kitchen, Emma, headphones on, was studying. Open anatomy books, highlighters marking passages. She looked up when she saw her mum walk in. "Hey, Mum, you okay?" "Yeah, just tired. It was rough today," Helen said, dropping her bag on one of the chairs and sitting down with a long sigh. Emma watched her for a moment. Something different happened today. Helen hesitated, then smiled slightly, half tired, half thoughtful. A man at the subway. He was trying to get through the turnstile, but his card wouldn't work. Looked kinda lost, like he was soaked on the inside, you know. Emma frowned, curious. "Did you help him?" Helen nodded, grabbing a mug and pouring the rest of the coffee from the thermos. "Just a small gesture, but I don't know. I kept thinking about him afterward. Sometimes I think people just need a tiny push not to sink completely." Emma took off her headphones and rested her chin on her palm, studying her mother carefully. "It really got to you, huh?" Helen nodded slowly, stayed quiet for a few seconds before answering. "I can't explain it. He seemed absent, like he'd forgotten what it's like to be in the world, like he'd been ripped from somewhere and left there in the middle of the station, trying to remember who he was. Maybe he was just going through something," Emma suggested. Helen gave a half smile. "We all are. But there's a kind of silence that only shows up when someone's lost something they can't name. Maybe he'll come back tomorrow," Emma said after a moment. Helen didn't respond, but she knew she'd be there at the same time. They ate dinner in silence. The sound of the spoon against the plate, the soft clink of the water glass. The house, though modest, was wrapped in a rare peace, a bubble Helen had fought hard to build, and even with so little, she had created a home where one could breathe. Before bed, Helen opened her sketchbox, pulled out a blank piece of paper, and started to doodle without thinking. She drew a figure sitting alone on a subway bench. Next to it, a hunched shadow, almost transparent. In the bottom corner, she wrote in pencil, "Sometimes all it takes is a hand." She folded the paper carefully and tucked it away, and before turning off the light, she felt a quiet certainty. That story wasn't over yet. The alarm went off at 5:30. Helen got up slowly, her body begging for one more hour in bed, and her mind reminding her of unpaid bills. She took a quick shower, tied her hair in a loose bun, and put on her clean but worn uniform, made strong coffee, and wrapped a piece of bread with margarine in a napkin, the usual routine. But there was a subtle difference that morning. The image of the man from the subway still lingered in her thoughts. On the way to the station, she wasn't exactly thinking about him. She was thinking about the feeling of having seen him, that kind of absence, like he was wrapped in fog on the inside. Helen knew that look. It was the same one she saw in patients hearing tough diagnoses, or in mothers waiting for news that never came. It wasn't despair. It was the pause before collapse. She arrived at the station at the same time, the 6:47 train, kept her pace calm even as the crowd rushed around her. And there he was, same coat, unshaven face, no card in his hands anymore, just him, standing still, eyes fixed on the station signs, like he was trying to decipher where he was supposed to go. Helen didn't greet him. She walked to the end of the platform and leaned against the wall. When the train arrived, she stepped into the last car, glanced discreetly over her shoulder. He got on too, stood near the door, holding the metal pole. Avoided looking at her, but he knew she was there. In the days that followed, it became routine. Helen arrived, he was there. Same spot, same quiet expression. No words exchanged, no forced closeness. But there was a silent understanding between them, a constant presence, like someone who had become part of the other's scenery. Helen started noticing small details, the way he furrowed his brow when the train braked, how his ink-stained fingers were always restless. One day she saw he wore the same shoes. One had a hole on the side. On another, she noticed he carried a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket, like a lucky charm. She thought about asking his name, but there was something sacred in that silence, something that shouldn't be broken by force. On a particularly cold morning, Helen stepped into the train with gloved hands and sleep-swollen eyes. She was so distracted, she almost didn't notice him approaching. When she did, he was already beside her. Without a word, he placed a piece of paper on the seat next to her and walked to the other end of the car. Helen looked around. No one was paying attention. She picked up the paper carefully, as if holding something alive. It was a pencil drawing, a small boy, arms stretched toward the sky, trying to catch the sun in his hands. The lines were simple, but the image held something powerful, something that said more than 1,000 words. She held onto the drawing for the rest of the ride. When she got off at her stop, she folded it carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat, next to her hospital badge. The rest of the day passed with a gentle weight in her chest. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, a feeling she hadn't named in years, a kind of memory of something too beautiful to be spoken aloud. That night, the apartment felt quieter than usual. Emma was studying in her room, and Helen sat alone in the kitchen, stove light on, a piece of toast with butter in her hand. She pulled out the box where she kept her drawings and opened it carefully. Inside were simple landscapes, faces she'd seen on the street, hospital scenes. She placed the new drawing on top of the stack. Then she sat at the table and began to sketch. Without thinking too much, like she used to as a girl, she drew two faces side by side, looking in opposite directions. Between them, a jagged line, and below she wrote, "Two worlds that don't touch, but walk together for a moment." She folded the paper and put it away. The next morning she woke up before the alarm, not because she was late, but because for the first time in a long time, she wanted to see someone. That morning had a different kind of light. The sky was still grey, but there was a diffused clarity, as if the day were trying to be kind. Helen left home a little earlier. She wore her light blue scrubs over a thermal shirt, tied her hair more tightly, and before leaving she grabbed something from the drawer, the drawing of the boy trying to hold the sun. She tucked it into her backpack pocket, between her wallet and her lunch, as if it were a protective charm. She knew he would be at the station, and even without knowing his name, she knew that man, strange yet familiar, was already part of her routine, more than she cared to admit. When she reached the platform, he was already there. Leaning against the wall of cracked tiles, his gaze distant but present. Helen hesitated for a second before approaching. He saw her but didn't move. He just followed her arrival with his eyes. This time, she stopped a few steps away, took a small envelope from her backpack and placed it on a nearby bench with the drawing she had made the night before. Then she walked away without saying a word. When the train arrived, they both got on. He sat at one end and she at the opposite. The paper remained on the bench until the man discreetly picked it up and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, the same spot where his crumpled paper used to be. That morning, during the ride, their eyes met for the first time for more than 3 seconds. A brief time, too short for any declaration, but long enough to create an invisible thread between them. It was as if both recognized the gesture without needing to confirm it. The hospital felt louder than usual that day. Alarms, hurried footsteps, stretchers being pushed quickly through narrow hallways. Helen did her job efficiently, but her thoughts were elsewhere. As she collected sheets and emptied trash cans, she remembered his eyes, that kind of gaze that asked for nothing but said everything. She wondered where he came from, tried to guess his story just from the details. The way he adjusted his coat as if hiding something, the way he watched others always cautiously. He seemed like someone who didn't want to be seen, but couldn't stand to be ignored. During her lunch break, Helen sat alone in the cafeteria. She carried an old notebook where she sometimes wrote scattered phrases. She scribbled, "Sometimes the silence between two people is more intimate than any conversation." Then she drew a pair of shoes side by side, touching but not quite. In the days that followed, she kept bringing 2 coffees. A simple gesture, but one that gained weight as it was repeated. There was something ritualistic about it, as if by sharing coffee, they acknowledged each other without needing to explain. He never refused. He'd take the cup with still cold hands and give a slight nod, like someone grateful for something that had no name. Once, he left a small object on the bench before exiting the train. A pen cap with a hand-drawn flower on it. Helen kept it. More than words, it was these details that told their story. At home, Emma started noticing subtle changes in her mother. She was lighter, still tired, still overworked, but there was a new spark in her eyes, as if the weight of life had, for a moment, been shared with someone. "You're different, Mum," Emma said one night as they washed dishes together. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. You're more distracted, but in a good way." Helen smiled, but didn't answer. One night, Helen dreamed of the station. In the dream, he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered drawings. When she approached, he handed her one. It was the sun being pulled by a string, like a kite. When she woke up, Helen sketched the image before it could fade. The next day, she left the folded drawing on the bench, along with a small note. "I still don't know your name, but I know how to recognize someone who's come back from the place where everything was lost." She didn't expect a response, But the following day, something was different. He had a notebook, sitting down, writing. When she approached, he tore out a page and handed it to her without looking. On the paper, a single handwritten sentence. "My name is Alan." Helen read the note, eyes fixed on the trembling letters. It was as if he had written it with a hesitant heart, like someone offering a secret. She folded the paper carefully, as if it was something precious. There were no words exchanged that day, but his name began to live in her thoughts. Alan, a simple, direct name. But now it carried the weight of his presence in the city's cold mornings. With the name came questions. Who was he? What did he do? Why did he seem so broken inside? But Helen knew how to wait. She wasn't the kind to rush truths. She understood that some stories need silence in order to be born. That night, before sleeping, she wrote in her notebook, "Now that I know your name, it feels like you exist a little more, but even before that, I already felt there was something in you that knew my loneliness." And for the first time in many years, Helen fell asleep smiling. In the days that followed, Alan kept offering small pieces of himself, fragments that didn't come in speeches or explanations, but in gestures, a note with a single word, a carefully folded object, a mark on the bench where he always sat. Each morning felt like a new page written in silence. Helen started carrying a small box inside her backpack. In it, she kept what he left behind, a paper flower, a red ink sketch of a star, a shaky-handed phrase that read, "Some people are shelter." They were items with no value to the world, but to her they had the exact weight of what is sincere. The subway, once just a means of transport, had become a meeting place, a space where the two of them, without arranging anything, met with the precision of a sacred ritual. There were no promises, no questions, just presence. And over time, that presence became what mattered most. One morning, the train was late. The platform was more crowded than usual, and Alan hadn't shown up. Helen grew tense, scanning the crowd, trying to hide her anxiety. When he finally appeared through the masses, her breath eased without her realizing. He was walking slower than usual, his face paler. He sat beside her and, without saying a word, rested one hand on the bench very close to hers. He didn't touch her, but the closeness said everything. Helen didn't move away. She left her hand there, still, almost as an invitation. That day, during the ride, they didn't look at each other. They just remained side by side. The silence between them was no longer absence. It was presence, a kind of communication that needed no sound, as if every rumble of the tracks confirmed what wasn't spoken. At the hospital, Helen moved through her shift with her body present and her mind elsewhere. One of the nurses, someone she rarely spoke to beyond a greeting, asked if she was in love. She laughed, but didn't answer, because she wasn't sure what she felt. Was it love? Was it hope? Or was it simply the mirror of a loneliness that, for a moment, had found company? That night at home, Helen opened her drawing box and began a new sketch. She drew two train cars side by side. In one, a woman with her eyes closed. In the other, a man with his hands on his knees looking at the floor. Between them, a line connected the cars, not through the tracks, but through a thread of light that seemed to leave one heart and reach the other. She wrote below, "Not every connection needs words. Sometimes staying is enough." The next morning, Helen arrived early. She brought a packet of cookies she had baked the night before and an extra coffee. When Alan arrived, she held out the package to him. He took it, looked at her a moment longer than usual, and murmured almost inaudibly, "Thank you." It was the first word he had spoken since telling her his name. Helen gave a soft smile, didn't respond. Just sat on the bench and watched the pale morning light slip through the station's iron bars. Later during the ride, Alan left something new, a torn page from his notebook with a collage made of magazine clippings, an image of two coffee cups, a flower, and a pair of hands close together but not touching. At the bottom he wrote, "What has no name still exists." Helen held the paper like someone holding a memory before it fades. It wasn't just kindness, it was care. It was a way of being seen that she hadn't felt in a long time. As she got off at her station, Alan gave her a small nod, and for a second she wanted to follow him, But she stayed. It wasn't time yet, but something inside her already knew. There was more to this story than casual encounters. There was a slow, steady path being drawn between two once scattered lives. That night, Helen tucked the collage into the box with the other objects and wrote another line in her notebook. Maybe this is how it starts again, with gestures too small to call love, but strong enough to call truth. And she fell asleep with the feeling that, for the first time in a long while, someone was waiting for her too. The days began to take on a different texture, no longer rigid blocks of routine, but like the pages of a well-used notebook, full of marks, details, and little scribbles in the corners. For Helen, mornings stopped being just the prelude to work. They became quiet encounters that warmed the soul before the world demanded too much. At the station, everything remained the same. The screech of the train brakes, the muffled announcements over the loudspeakers, the sound of hurried footsteps. But within that cold mechanical universe, there was a pocket of quiet warmth every time Alan arrived. He always came from the same side of the platform, always wore the same worn grey coat, and carried in his eyes that silent exhaustion Helen had come to recognize. Only now there was something different about him, a nearly invisible light, as if being there was no longer just a habit, but an anchor. On a colder than usual morning, Helen offered him coffee as she always did. He took the cup and this time let his fingers touch hers for a second longer. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But for Helen, that brief contact brought back a strange memory of a time when touch came not with fear or caution, but with tenderness. She said nothing, just sat beside him, and they remained in silence, staring at the dark tunnel ahead. In the train car, during the ride, Alan seemed restless. His eyes scanned the floor, the walls, as if looking for something. Helen watched from a distance, respecting his space. Then, in a quick motion, he pulled something from his pocket, a folded drawing. He walked over to her, handed her the paper without saying a word, and returned to his seat. Helen waited for the train to round a curve before opening the paper. It was a simple pencil sketch, almost childlike. A street stand with sweets laid out on an improvised table. Behind it, a woman with long hair sitting on a crate. Next to her, a boy smiling, barefoot, holding a coin in his hand. She frowned. It felt like more than a sketch. It was a memory, a snapshot of childhood. When she looked at Alan, he was watching her with a different expression, as if the drawing had cost much more than just graphite and paper. There was vulnerability there, a door slightly open. Helen spent the rest of the day wrapped in a haze of memories that weren't her own. As she scrubbed the hospital's cold hallway floor, the image of the candy stand reappeared before her eyes like a real scene. She could almost smell burnt sugar, hear the clinking of coins, see the boy smile with caramel-stained lips. That image followed her like an echo, resonating with something she didn't understand but deeply respected. In the break room during her 15-minute pause, she opened her notebook. Not to draw, just to look at what she had already made. The lines now seemed to take on new meanings. She began to understand that what they were building wasn't just symbolic exchange, it was a bridge. Alan was telling his story the only way he knew how, and she was responding the only way she could, by being there. In the following days, Alan seemed more introspective. He left no notes, no drawings. But whenever he looked at her, his gaze was more direct, as if now that he had exposed part of himself, he was watching to see if she would still stay. And she did. She sat next to him, shared coffee, and remained. That was what mattered most. One afternoon after work, Helen decided to take a walk. She passed a park where children played and elderly men fed pigeons with bits of bread. She sat on a wooden bench and just watched the world. She remembered her own childhood, the smell of fried dough in her grandmother's kitchen, afternoons spent drawing on the living room floor. She wondered what Alan had lost. Who was the woman behind the stand? His mother, an aunt, a happy memory, or a point of pain? The next day, she decided to try something. She brought a second drawing with her, a split scene. On the left, the stand empty, no one around. On the right, the boy sitting alone, staring into nothing. She folded the drawing into an envelope along with a handwritten note. What's missing shapes who we are. Alan took the envelope as always, without opening it right away. During the ride, he kept it in his lap. Only at the end of the trip, just as Helen was about to get off, did he look up and meet her gaze. There was no pain in his eyes, only acceptance, a silent recognition that she now knew. The next morning, Helen arrived at the station and found Alan already waiting. Something in his posture had changed. He looked less hunched, more present. Beside him was a small red notebook. When she approached, he handed it to her without a word. She hesitated, then accepted it. Inside were pages filled with drawings, many of them. The candy stand, yes, but also scenes of streets, staircases, worn-out shoes, open hands. At the end, a loose sheet with a single sentence. "The first thing I lost was the sound of her laughter." Helen closed the notebook gently, sat beside him as always, and this time she touched his hand, not by accident, but by choice. After that day, Alan started drawing more often. Every morning he brought something new, a playground scene, a bicycle tipped on the sidewalk, a half-open door with light pouring through the cracks, and Helen responded. She wrote phrases, drew with him, sometimes just held the papers in her hands to warm them. They had never spoken about the past. There had never been a "tell me about your life." Yet Helen knew more about Alan than she did about many people she'd known for years, because what he shared came from places words can't reach. That week, Emma noticed the change. "Mom, you're calmer. You seem different." Helen smiled, stirring her tea. "Some days it feels like life changes without making a sound." Emma looked at her, curious. "Is there someone?" Helen hesitated, then replied, "There's someone teaching me how to remember myself." That night, Helen drew something new, a pair of small hands holding a melted candy, and above it, a single word written carefully, "beginning." Because that's what it was, a beginning again. The next day, a thick fog covered the subway tracks like an old forgotten blanket. Helen arrived earlier than usual, not out of anxiety. It was as if something inside her knew the morning would be different. Alan arrived minutes later. He wore the same grey coat, but there was an uncommon restlessness in his eyes. In his hands, the same red notebook, now more worn, its corners bent. When she approached, he handed her something wrapped in a simple cloth. He said nothing, just nodded and looked back at the ground. Helen sat beside him and unwrapped it carefully. It was a photograph, old, with worn edges. It showed a boy, the same from the drawing, beside a woman with tired eyes but a wide smile. Both stood in front of a makeshift stand, colourful sweets stacked on a wooden board. On the back, a single note. Brooklyn, 1997. She sat there looking at the image for a long time. Alan didn't explain, and Helen didn't ask. But in that heavy silence, the picture said everything. That was his mother. That was the childhood he was trying to stitch back together with sketches. At the next station, when the train arrived, they boarded together, sat side by side, and this time they sat close. Not like strangers keeping a respectful distance, but like two lives that recognized survival and sorrow in each other. Alan began writing more. Small fragments of stories, blurred memories. One sentence each morning. Helen collected every one, pasting them into her notebook like someone piecing together an emotional puzzle. One morning he wrote, "We used to hide from the rain under a truck tarp. At night she told stories by candlelight in a glass jar." The next day, "The last candy she tried to sell didn't sell, it was her favorite. I ate it, and I cried." Helen read with tearful eyes, but never pushed. She let him share what he could, at the pace he needed, and he did. Slowly, like someone pouring water over a withered plant, one sip at a time. One evening at home, Emma saw her mother pasting another note into her notebook. "He hasn't said what happened yet." Helen shook her head. "He doesn't need to, he's showing me." Emma smiled, curious. "And what are you showing him?" Helen thought for a moment, then replied, "That he can still trust someone." The next day, Helen brought a different drawing. It was the same scene from the photo, the stand, the boy, and the woman, but this time she added a third figure in the background, like a shadow watching from afar. Herself. Not as part of that memory, but as someone witnessing the pain without invading it. She folded the paper gently and handed it to Alan when the train arrived. He took his time opening it. When he finally did, he stared at the drawing for several seconds, then placed it back in the envelope and tucked it into his coat. When his eyes returned to hers, they were shining in a way Helen had never seen before. It wasn't sadness or gratitude, it was recognition. At the hospital, the day dragged on. Helen scrubbed corridors, but her mind was still on that moment. She felt Alan was nearing the edge of telling what had long been buried, and though he hadn't said it, she knew something terrible had interrupted that childhood. The next morning, Alan arrived without the notebook. In his hands, just a folded sheet of paper. Helen already sensed it would be different. When he handed it to her, his eyes didn't look away, as if they were saying, "Read it, but stay." On the paper, it said, "She died in winter. We lost our shelter after they took everything. I tried to wake her, but she didn't answer. I didn't scream. I just lay beside her and waited for morning. I thought the world had ended, but it didn't. It just got quieter." Helen held her breath. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. She simply pressed the paper to her chest. Alan kept his eyes down as if regretting it. She touched his shoulder, said nothing, but stayed. For several days, there were no drawings, no notes, just presence, shared silence. And that was enough. On a rainy morning, while they waited for the train, Helen handed him a thick envelope. Inside, dozens of small papers, all the drawings, notes, and collages he had given, each one carefully glued onto blank sheets. And at the end, a message written in steady handwriting, "You're not alone in the memory now, it's mine too." Alan read it, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time, he held Helen's hand with intention, not to thank her, but to remain. That night, Helen looked out the window at the sky. The clouds still covered everything, but there was a gap, and through it, a single star shone, small but steady, and for the first time, she felt something was truly changing. In the days that followed, Alan's presence beside Helen became more constant, more solid. It was no longer just a ritual of coffee and notes. It was a shared routine, quiet and intimate. One morning, he waited for her with a folded newspaper on his lap. When she arrived, Alan discreetly pointed to a small news piece on the last page. Anonymous donations fund restoration of old community library in Brooklyn. Below, a photo of a woman smiling, surrounded by children with books in their hands. In the corner of the image, almost imperceptible, a signature in blue ink, A.H. Foundation. Helen read in silence, then looked up at Alan. She didn't ask anything, but she understood everything. He had begun to give back, in his own way, and he was starting with the places that had shaped who he once was. That night, Helen wrote in her notebook, "When pain becomes action, something stronger than the past is born, a path." And with that thought, she fell asleep, not afraid, but hopeful. The next day, Helen brought a simple gift, a handmade bookmark by Emma, a drawing of two people sitting on a bench with a cup between them. Below it, a heart stitched in red thread. She handed it to Alan as they boarded the train. He received it with both hands, examined it carefully, then placed it inside the notebook between his sketched pages. It was his way of saying it would be kept. For the first time, when the train reached the final stop, Alan didn't get off. He stayed seated, waiting. And when Helen hesitated, he motioned to the seat beside him. She sat down. And together, for the first time, they continued the journey, beyond what they were used to. On the way home, Helen and Alan walked along the wet sidewalk in silence. Before saying goodbye, he took a small folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her without a word. Inside, a single drawing, two open umbrellas leaning against each other under the same rain. Helen smiled, and for the first time said softly, "Good night, Alan." He smiled back, and the night, even damp and cold, felt a little less lonely. Winter had begun to retreat slowly, like someone leaving against their own will. The mornings were still cold, but the light seemed different, less dull, more clear, as if something were changing not just in the weather, but within people too. Helen now woke up before the alarm. She made 2 coffees, wrapped Alan's in a cloth to keep it warm, and included a napkin with a handwritten word. Strength, courage, light. Words that, for her, carried more than meaning. They were presence. Alan read each one like someone hearing a voice after a long silence, and he responded with gestures, sometimes a new drawing, sometimes just a lingering look as the train departed. They were moving towards something they didn't yet know how to name, but already recognized. One Saturday morning, Helen decided to get off 1 stop earlier. Not by mistake, but by choice. She wanted to see where Alan went. He noticed, but wasn't surprised. They walked together down a quiet street, away from downtown. Alan stopped in front of a small iron door. Inside a simple house surrounded by trees and an overgrown garden, he opened the gate, looked at her, and said for the first time, "Do you want to come in?" The house was silent, but alive. Old paintings on the walls, books stacked in every corner, a worn-out couch with a folded blanket. In the center of the living room, a table covered with jars of paint, pencils, and clippings. It was a studio disguised as a home. Helen moved carefully. There was a wooden box sealed with tape. Alan nodded. She opened it. Papers, letters, childhood drawings, notes from his mother. At the bottom, a sentence. "You are made of light, even on dark days." Mom. She read it silently and returned it with reverence. "There's something in you that still shines," she said. Then they sat on the couch. Helen drew in Alan's notebook, the 2 of them on the station bench, with the word, "Here." He laughed, a low, unfamiliar, almost shy laugh. It was as if the sound of himself was slowly returning. In the garden, in front of a withered rose bush, he said, "She planted this. It hasn't bloomed in years." Helen knelt, touched the soil. Maybe it just needs some company to bloom again. He returned with water. They watered it together, and in that gesture, a silent pact was made. Before leaving, she noticed an empty frame hanging on the wall. "Why is it there?" "Because I didn't know what to put in it." Days later, Helen brought a drawing, 2 benches, 2 people, a train in the background. In the corner, the word, "Meeting." He framed it immediately. "You saw, and you didn't look away," Alan said. At the hospital, Helen smiled more. She felt life blooming again. Emma noticed. "He's good for you? He's trying to remember how to be good to himself, and that's a good start." Another Saturday, Helen arrived early. The rosebush was beginning to show a flower bud. She smiled, rang the bell, was welcomed with a hug. The first one, the simplest, the most sincere. They spent the morning in silence, doing small tasks. Alan watched as she set the table. "You act like life can still be beautiful." It is. Sometimes it just needs to be reminded. As she was leaving, he said, "What if one day you can't come? Then I'll come the next. I always come back." On Sunday, Alan woke up early, opened his notebook. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the blank page. He drew Helen, sitting on the bench with a cup in her hands, looking at him. In the corner, one word, beginning. And he knew that loneliness was just a station he had passed through. But he wasn't there anymore. The next morning, Alan returned to the station with a different expression. Still serious, still reserved, but there was something new in his posture, a lightness, a subtle ease in his step. Helen noticed immediately. As they sat on the bench, he handed her a small cardboard box tied with twine. Inside, a handmade bookmark with a delicate painting of a blooming flower and a note. "They bloom faster when someone believes." Helen pressed the box to her chest, and in that wordless gesture, Alan understood that what he was building with her wasn't just comfort. It was courage to keep going. And as the train arrived, they stood up together. Not because the destination demanded it, but because now the path was shared. The month turned under a heavy sky. The low-hanging clouds signaled a coming storm that seemed to match the internal weather Alan had carried all week. He was different, quieter than usual, his eyes more distant. Even during their morning meetings, the silence between him and Helen, once comforting, now felt heavy. Helen noticed on the first day. She tried to ease the tension with a note. Cloudy days also prepare the ground for flowers. Alan tucked the paper away without reading it on the spot. It wasn't rudeness, it was self-protection. On Tuesday, he didn't show up, nor on Wednesday. Helen felt a growing restlessness in her chest, not from neediness but intuition. Something had happened, and she knew his silence now was of a different kind. It was absence. On Thursday, she made a decision. She asked to leave work early and went to Alan's house. The garden was undisturbed, but the windows were shut. She knocked, waited. Nothing. Knocked again. Louder. No response. She was about to walk away when she heard the lock click. Alan opened the door with sunken eyes, dark circles, and an unshaven face. He looked thinner, holding an envelope in his hands. "I need to show you something." She stepped in quietly. The house was dark and stuffy. Papers were scattered everywhere, as if he'd rummaged through old boxes looking for something. In the middle of the table, a photo. Alan, older, next to a broad man with a hard expression. His father. "He died this week," he said, voice low, nearly soundless. "They called me from the nursing home. I went to the funeral alone." Helen came closer and sat beside him. She said nothing, just took his hand. "He never forgave me," Alan continued, "for choosing art, for leaving home, for not coming back when he got sick. That pain didn't start now. It was old, calcified by time. His father's silence had shaped Alan's. "You went," Helen said, calm and firm. "You went now, even if he didn't hear it." Alan squeezed his eyes shut. A tear rolled down, but he didn't try to hide it. After a long, quiet moment, he got up and went to a shelf in the hallway. He returned with a cardboard box labeled with old stickers, "Drafts, never finished." He brought it to the living room and emptied it on the floor. Worn notebooks, loose pages, clippings from old newspapers, all filled with lines, fragments of a story left undone. "This was supposed to be a book, but I stopped halfway. I never thought anyone would want to read it." Helen knelt by the pile. She began to carefully sort through the pages. She read a sentence. "When pain has no name, we draw it so it can exist. Maybe no one reads it now, but I want to, and if I've read it, then it already exists." Alan took a deep breath, sat beside her on the floor, and together they spent hours reorganizing the past into a new order. The next afternoon, Helen returned to Alan's house with a box of colored paper, paints, and brushes. Emma came along at Alan's invitation. It would be her first time. She arrived shy, hiding slightly behind her mother. Alan awkwardly offered her a small red book filled with drawings of animals he'd done. Emma sat on the rug and started coloring slowly. "She's quiet," Alan said. "She watches before she trusts," Helen replied, "just like you." While Emma drew, Helen and Alan organized his old notebooks on a shelf. Later, the three of them had tea together. For the first time, Alan's house didn't feel like an isolated refuge. It felt like home. By late afternoon, Emma handed him a handmade card. Inside, a simple message. "Thanks for drawing animals. They're pretty, even when they're sad." Alan taped the card to the studio wall. At the door, Emma gave his arm a quick hug, testing the space, not fully sure. But it was a gesture, a beginning. As Helen and her daughter were about to leave, Alan called out, "Wait!" He went inside and returned with an envelope. "This is for you." Inside, a new drawing. 3 people sitting in a garden under a clear sky. In the background, a blooming tree. In the corner, a word. Present. Helen tucked the paper away carefully, like someone protecting a seed. On the way home, Emma said, "He doesn't talk much, huh?" Helen smiled. "He speaks in his own way, and sometimes it's the most beautiful one." That night, back at home, Helen found another envelope at the bottom of her backpack. She recognized Alan's handwriting. Inside, a folded sheet. a pair of hands holding a half-open flower, as if waiting for spring to fully bloom. Next to it, a sentence: "Not everything beautiful is born ready. Thank you for watering." Helen laid her head on the pillow, her eyes wet. She stared at the dark ceiling and for the first time in a long while didn't feel afraid of the next day, because now she too was blooming. Helen woke before sunrise. The house was still asleep. Emma breathed softly in the room next door, and the pale light from the street crept through the thin curtain like a secret. Sitting at the edge of the bed, she held Alan's envelope in her hands. She had read and reread the drawing and the phrase. But what kept her still wasn't the words. It was what they stirred in the silence that followed. It was strange being seen, really seen, not as a hospital worker, not as the responsible mother, not as someone constantly carrying the world on her shoulders without complaint, but as a person, with cracks, with layers, with beauty, even in the mess. She wondered when she had started to hide, maybe when she lost her husband, maybe when she had to pretend to be strong in front of her daughter, maybe when she realized being practical was more useful than being sensitive. And little by little she had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by simple gestures. But Alan wasn't trying to save her. He didn't ask for explanations. He just stayed. He looked. He listened. With a kind of attention you can't buy, can't rehearse. The kind of attention that only comes from someone who knows pain, because they've been through it. And that stirred something in her, a forgotten tenderness, something rising from deep within, like a rusted muscle learning to move again. It wasn't love in the romantic sense, not yet, not the kind from movies or flower shop cards. It was a rare kind of connection, built from what's left after the world has taken everything else. Helen took a deep breath. She knew it was fragile, that it could fall apart. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could walk towards someone without fearing she'd disappear in the process. She got up slowly, placed the drawing in the drawer with her most important documents, and smiled. A small smile, intimate, almost imperceptible, but real, because even without saying it out loud, she knew she was alive, and she wasn't alone anymore. Alan's name appeared in old newspaper headlines. Helen discovered this on a rainy Sunday, while helping Emma with a school assignment on local biographies. She typed his name out of curiosity, and the past appeared like a shattered mirror. Finance executive steps down after family scandal. Son of prominent banker leaves board, disappears from public eye. Alan Mayer breaks with legacy, sells shares of family holding company. She read the articles slowly. There were no formal accusations, no public tragedies. But everything was there between the lines. A man who refused to inherit an empire, a son who rejected the weight of his last name, an executive who, one day, simply vanished, without a statement, without ceremony, without return. On Monday, Helen arrived at the station with a more watchful gaze. Alan was already on the bench holding his coffee, his coat damp from the drizzle. She sat beside him, as she always did, and after a minute of silence, she spoke plainly. "I looked you up." Alan didn't respond. He just fixed his eyes on a spot on the sidewalk ahead. "You used to be someone known, important." "I still am," he said without irony. "I just changed what matters." Helen stayed silent, absorbing the reply. "Why did you leave?" Alan leaned his elbows on his knees, thought for a while before answering. "Because I was drowning in a dry place. Everyone applauded me on the outside, but inside I was screaming, and no one heard." She nodded. She knew what that felt like, living in a space too small for what you feel. Alan ran a tired hand through his hair. "My father wanted me to be like him, cold, precise, ruthless. But I sketched on the backs of reports, painted watercolor along the margins of spreadsheets. Deep down I had left long before I actually left." Helen smiled, not with mockery, but with recognition. "Sometimes we spend half our lives trying to please ghosts." Alan looked at her, a mix of surprise and respect in his eyes. That line hit him hard. "He called me weak, said art was for people who couldn't handle the real world. And now? Now, he died, never knowing that this, he pointed to his notebook, is what saved me. Silence returned, but this time it was light. That week, something different happened. On Thursday, Helen saw a well-dressed man waiting at the station near where Alan usually sat. Sharp suit, white hair, a proud gaze. He watched Alan from a distance. On Saturday, the man returned. This time, Helen approached him. "Waiting for someone?" The man smiled, polite. "I'm observing. Alan Mayer is an old acquaintance." "Friend?" "Brother." The word hit like a punch. Alan had never mentioned having a brother. The man continued, "I thought he was dead, but it seems he's just hiding." Helen kept her composure. "Maybe he's just somewhere he feels whole." The man smiled again, as if not taking it seriously. "He belongs elsewhere, he'll remember that." On Monday, Alan arrived tense. Helen noticed immediately. "You saw him," Alan said, not needing explanation. "He said he was your brother." Alan nodded, tired. "My brother stayed. He inherited everything. The company, the papers, the packed calendar, but he lost his soul in the process. And now he wants you back? He wants me to forget who I've become." Helen took a deep breath. "And will you?" Alan stared into the bottom of his coffee cup for a long moment. "No, but I'm afraid he'll try to pull me back. And I'm not as strong as I look." Helen touched his hand. "Then I'll hold on with you, until the fear passes." And he believed her. On Tuesday, Alan showed up early. He carried a sealed envelope. When Helen arrived, he handed it to her without a word. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear brother, I didn't come back for a fight, just to tell you I'm okay, that I found a path where I don't need to win every day to feel worthy. You chose to stay on the board, I chose to leave the game. If you ever want to talk as two men without inherited names, I'm here. But if you'd rather stay king in your castle, I wish you peace. Truthfully, Alan." Helen folded the letter carefully. Alan watched her, tense. "I'm sending it today," he said. "That's it. Nothing more." Helen smiled. Sometimes closing one door is the first step to opening another. That night, Alan returned to his studio. He pulled out an old unfinished canvas from behind the cabinet. It was an incomplete landscape, a colorless sky, leafless trees. He began to paint slowly, pale blue in the sky, soft green on the tips of the branches, a dirt path, and in the distance a train station. In the bottom corner he painted two figures sitting side by side, Helen and himself. At the end of the week, the station was crowded, but in the midst of the crowd, they found each other easily. She arrived with a new napkin, this time with only one word: choice. Alan read it, tucked it away, and said, "I choose to stay." The train arrived. They didn't board. They sat on the bench and stayed there, simply together. No rush, no masks, just themselves. The city carried on outside, noisy and urgent. But on that concrete bench, two people had done the impossible. They were. The days continued with a gentle rhythm. The train came and went, the coffee was shared, and the silences between Helen and Alan became a kind of companionship. There was no longer a need to fill time with words. Gestures said what mattered. But every calm carries within it the seed of change. That Wednesday, Helen left the hospital with her shoulders hunched. She'd received notice from her supervisor. Her shift would be changing. She would no longer work mornings. Her new schedule would begin in the afternoon, which meant she wouldn't pass through the station at coffee time anymore. She walked slowly to the usual spot. Alan was already there, sketching with his notebook resting on his knees. "I've got news," she said, trying to sound light. "They changed my shift. Starting next week, I won't be here at this time." Alan didn't respond immediately. He looked away for a moment, as if searching for an exit on the horizon. "I see. It's not goodbye, just a detour." He nodded, but Helen knew. Detours can create distance too. That weekend, she took him to visit an old park where she used to take Emma when she was little. They wandered among tall trees and worn wooden benches. They sat by a lake. "This place reminds me of when things were simpler," Helen said. Alan watched the ducks on the water, distracted. For me, simplicity always felt like an unreachable luxury. Maybe now it isn't anymore. He looked at her, for a few seconds, as if trying to memorize every line of her face, then looked away. On the walk back, Alan made an unexpected detour and took her to an old brick building on a quiet street. They climbed a narrow staircase. The paint on the door was peeling. "I bought this place years ago," he said. "I wanted to open a studio, but I never got started." She stepped in carefully. The space was wide, with high windows and worn wooden floors, bare walls the scent of old paint. In the corner, an easel covered by a cloth. Alan pulled off the cloth. An unfinished portrait. Helen. She took a deep breath, surprised. "You were painting this?" "I was trying to understand what I saw in you, but I never knew how to finish it." She stepped closer to the canvas. "Maybe because you're still seeing." On Monday, she began her new shift. Her routine changed. Mornings became quieter. The bench was empty, the coffee alone. Emma noticed the difference. "You don't see the man anymore." "Not at the same times," Helen replied. On Wednesday, she came home and found an envelope in the mailbox. She recognized Alan's handwriting. Inside, a single page and an illustration. It was her sitting on the station bench, but surrounded by flowers. On the back, he'd written, "If the time changes, I'll wait at the right station." Helen placed the page inside her bedside book. She didn't cry, but she felt the absence like someone hearing a song that still echoes, even after it stops. Days passed, until one morning on her day off, she decided to go back to the station. No rush, no warning. Alan wasn't there. She sat on the bench, waited a few minutes, checked the clock, waited a little more. Then an envelope slid under her bag. She turned. It was Emma. "He asked me to give you this." Helen opened the envelope carefully. "Today it's your choice whether to stay. I'm at the studio. Doors open." She took Emma's hand. They walked in silence. The way to the building was short, but each step felt weighted. Helen climbed the stairs with her heart racing. Emma walked beside her, taking in everything with quiet curiosity. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it gently. Alan was kneeling on the floor, unpacking boxes, spreading out paints. Canvases leaned against the walls. Instrumental music filled the space. When he looked up and saw them, he smiled. A calm smile without expectation, just presence. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come. I thought maybe you wouldn't be here." He reached out his hand. Emma was the first to walk in. She went straight to a small table where there were papers, colored pencils, paintbrushes. She began drawing without asking, like she already knew the place. Helen approached slowly. "It's beautiful in here. It's still being built. Like us." Alan looked at her. No words were needed. His eyes said, "Yes." She walked over to a covered canvas and pulled the cloth aside. It was the finished portrait of her. But now she wasn't alone in the painting. Emma was beside her, and in the background, a man with paint-stained hands. The three of them, in the middle of a blooming garden. Helen took a deep breath. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to pull away. "What if this doesn't work?" "Then we paint again." He handed her a paintbrush. "Want to help?" She took it, dipped it into the paint, made a shy stroke on the canvas. Emma looked over, then laughed. "Mom paints crooked." They all laughed. And there, among crooked lines and improvised colors, something new was born. Not an ending, but the kind of beginning that only exists when people choose to stay, even when everything changes. That evening, the city kept its rhythm. The trains ran, the clocks turned. But inside that studio, time stopped. Just for a moment. Just long enough for 3 lives to decide that there, among unfinished canvases and patched-up hearts, love could finally take root. Winter arrived early that year. The mornings were gray, and the steam rising from Helen's coffee curled like a shy smoke from her hands, as the studio had now become her new station. The changes had settled, not as temporary adjustments but as a steady rhythm. Emma went to school smiling, and Helen split her days between the hospital and the art space Alan now called home. There were days when the past threatened to blow in its cold memories. Alan's brother continued to send occasional invitations to gala events, dinners with important people, offers wrapped in expensive envelopes. Alan kept them unopened. Sometimes he burned them, as if sealing his choice again each time temptation knocked. Helen observed all of it, with the kind of attentiveness that doesn't interfere, but sustains. She knew. True choices aren't made once. They're reaffirmed every day. Emma grew up among canvases and brushes. Her drawings began filling the studio walls, mixed with Alan's. There was something symbolic in that. The lines of a child blending with those of a man who had once been afraid to be seen. On the first snowfall of the year, something changed. Alan arrived at the studio earlier than usual. He had an envelope in his hands, but unlike the others, this one was from him, to Helen. She opened it and read silently, "I want to show you something. Today, at the station." He didn't write anything else. Helen closed the envelope slowly. She put on her coat, pulled a hat over Emma's head, and the two of them left before lunch. Snow had begun to pile up along the sidewalks. Their steps made a muffled sound, as if even the world were walking in silence. The station was empty, the benches cold. But there he was, Alan, standing beside an easel set up on the concrete, brushes in his pockets, eyes fixed on the blank canvas. When he saw Helen, he smiled, a smile that didn't ask for validation, but shared certainty. "Painting outside now?" she teased. "Just today, to close the circle where it all began." She stepped closer. Emma ran to him and held his hand. The canvas was blank. "I don't know what to paint yet," he admitted. Helen looked at him gently. "Then paint what you feel." Alan took a deep breath, picked up a brush, dipped it in blue, drew a curved line, like the silhouette of a distant horizon. Then strokes in shades of red, hinting at the first rays of sun. "What is it?" Helen asked. "Tomorrow." Helen sat beside him, like she had in the beginning. Emma pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing next to them. They stayed there for hours as daylight faded slowly. No fanfare, no rush. When the train finally arrived, its sound sliced through the silence like a memory. This time, no one had to decide whether to get on or not. The train left empty, and they remained. Alan looked at Helen. Her hands were cold. He held them in his. The warmth wasn't immediate, but it was steady. "Do you know why I waited for you that morning?" She shook her head. "Because deep down, even without knowing your name, I already knew your absence." Helen squeezed his fingers. "And now? Now I know your presence, and I don't want to go back to living without it." The sky darkened. The first station lights flickered on. Emma was drawing a tree. On the trunk, 3 initials, E-H-A. Helen leaned her head on Alan's shoulder. He kept painting, his strokes calm. The canvas now showed a bench, and 3 people sitting on it. In the background, a train pulling away, small, insignificant, because in that moment the train was no longer the destination. The destination was what they had built together, away from the noise, away from expectations, within the realm of what's possible when 2 wounds recognize each other and choose anyway to stay. And so, at that station that had witnessed meetings, partings, silences, and courage, 3 people stopped waiting for the right train, because they understood that sometimes the furthest place you can go is where you choose to stay. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what it meant to you. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. This is really important for the channel. Really important. And if you're ready for another story of love and hope, click the first card or the second one to watch the full playlist. See you there.